All right, so are you ready to dive into the Second Boer War? It gets intense, this one. A real clash of empires and ideologies.
Yeah, a global power, the British Empire, going up against these settlers who are absolutely determined to hold on to their independence.
From 1899 to 1902, the British Empire fought the South African Republic and the Orange Free State. And, I've been looking at these sources, and it's a brutal fight.
Really fascinating to see why it all started, the major turning points, the lasting impact, all that stuff.
For sure, and we'll definitely get into all of that. But first, let's set the stage a bit. You've got these Boer Republics, right? Founded by, well, descendants of Dutch settlers. And they were seriously independent, used to running their own show.
Not the type to just back down, especially when you have gold and diamonds being discovered right in their backyard.
Talk about adding fuel to the fire. The British saw dollar signs, obviously, and the tensions that were already simmering just boiled over. So you have these colonial ambitions, the scramble for resources, and the Boers are like, nope, not happening. This is our land, our way of life.
Right, and this is where things get really interesting. The Boers, they weren't messing around. They came out strong, scored some early victories that really surprised the British.
Yeah, I was reading about their tactics. They were masters of guerrilla warfare, using surprise attacks and ambushes. They even lured British troops into these, kill zones using their knowledge of the terrain.
They were incredibly mobile, knew the land like the back of their hand, strike hard and fast, then vanish back into the Velde.
Must have been infuriating for the British, who were used to these traditional organized battles. They had the numbers, the firepower, but at first, it was the Boers calling the shots.
And the British realized they'd stumbled into a fight unlike any they'd seen before. This was no small rebellion they could just crush.
So how did they respond? I mean, when they realized they were up against a much tougher opponent than they thought?
Well, let's just say they escalated things. They implemented a scorched-earth policy, and it was brutal.
This is where things get dark. It wasn't just about targeting bullfighters anymore. They started destroying anything that could support the Boers. Farms burned, crops destroyed, livestock slaughtered. It was devastating.
The idea was to cripple their ability to fight, cut off their supplies, break their morale. And it did work, to a point, but at a terrible human cost.
Reading those accounts of families fleeing their homes, seeing everything they'd worked for go up in flames, it's heartbreaking. They were left with nothing, forced to wander, searching for food and shelter.
And that's what led to the concentration camps. The British started rounding up Boer families, placing them in these camps.
And the conditions in those camps were horrific.
Yeah.
Overcrowding, poor sanitation, lack of food and medicine, disease was rampant, and the death toll, especially among children, was just staggering.
It's a tragic irony, right? Trying to crush the Boer spirit, they created a humanitarian crisis that probably fueled their resistance even more.
So you have the Boers facing this scorched earth policy, their families suffering in these camps, yet they still refused to give up. What kept them going?
Well, remember those commandos we mentioned? Those small mobile units. They became absolutely crucial.
Yeah, they weren't your typical military units. Small groups of expert marksmen and horsemen who knew the terrain like the back of their hand.
Each commando, maybe 200, 300 men, mostly volunteers, they elected their own leaders, and they were fiercely loyal. No heavy equipment, no rigid tactics.
So they could move fast, disappear, strike when the British least expected it, like ghosts popping up to harass the British, then vanishing before they could retaliate.
Exactly, and that constant pressure, those hit-and-run tactics, they started to wear the British down, militarily and psychologically. This was a war of attrition, and the Boers, outnumbered but incredibly resilient.
The British were in a real bind, weren't they? Their usual tactics were failing, and this guerrilla warfare was far more effective than they'd anticipated. What did they do to try and get control?
Well, they knew they had to adapt, and they did, on a couple of fronts. Militarily, they started building these fortified blockhouses, connected by barbed wire fences, basically trying to contain the Boers, restrict their movements, protect their own supply lines.
So instead of chasing them across the vast landscape, they started creating these fortified zones, trying to box them in. Huge undertaking, but it did start to shift the balance slowly.
But it wasn't just about brute force. They also realized they needed to win over the Boers, at least some of them. So they started offering aid, rebuilding some of the infrastructure they'd destroyed, a sort of hearts and minds campaign.
It makes you wonder, what if they'd focused on that from the beginning, building trust instead of just destroying everything?
It's an interesting thought. But honestly, they were caught off guard, surprised by the Boers' ferocity, the effectiveness of their tactics. They had to scramble to adjust.
And even with these changes, the war was far from over. The Boers fought on, determined to hold on to their way of life, even as things got tougher and tougher.
That resilience, it's remarkable. Fighting for their homes, their families, their very identity.
This war was about so much more than just land. It was a clash of cultures, a fight for survival. And the impact, well, that would be felt for generations to come.
And as we dig deeper into the later stages, we'll see just how profound those impacts really were.
So the British are adapting, right? Trying to contain those Boer commandos while also working on that Hearts and Minds campaign. But even with those changes, this war, it drags on, doesn't it?
It does. The Boers, they just refused to back down. Their commandos kept launching these lightning raids, hitting British outposts, disrupting supply lines. They knew how to hit hard and fast, then just melt back into the landscape.
I was reading about it, and it sounds like it was really demoralizing for the British troops. Always on edge, never knowing when or where the Boers would strike next.
It was a psychological war as much as a physical one. That constant pressure, the harsh environment, it all took a toll.
But the British had the numbers, the resources. Didn't they eventually start to turn the tide?
Eventually. But it was a slow, grinding process. They threw everything they had at the Boers. More troops, more blockhouses, relentlessly pursuing those commandos.
It was a war of attrition, wasn't it? Just trying to wear the Boers down through sheer force.
Exactly. And that strategy, coupled with the humanitarian crisis and the strain on their own resources, it finally forced the Boers to negotiate.
So after years of brutal fighting, both sides come to the table. What was that like? I imagine it was a pretty tense situation.
Oh, absolutely. In 1902, representatives from both sides met to try and hash out a peace agreement. That's what led to the Treaty of Vereeniging.
And what did that treaty lay out? Was it a fair deal for both sides?
Well, like most peace treaties, after long conflict, it involved compromises. But for the Boers, it was a tough pill to swallow. They had to give up their independence. Their republics were absorbed into the British Empire.
That must have been devastating. After fighting so hard to lose their independence, what did they get in return?
Some concessions. Boer fighters were granted amnesty. There was a promise of financial aid for rebuilding and a commitment to eventually granting self-government to those former republics.
So at least there's an attempt at reconciliation, even if it came at a high price.
Yeah, the British knew they couldn't just rule by force. They had to figure out a way to integrate the Boers, even if it was on their terms.
But let's be honest, going into this, the Boers wanted to keep their independence. To come out of it having lost that, I mean, it must have felt like a betrayal.
Yeah, I think that's understandable. They poured their heart and soul into this fight. They suffered terribly. But their leaders, they decided that peace, even under British rule, was better than the continued bloodshed.
So the war ends, the Boers lose their independence, South Africa is now firmly under British control. What happens next? I mean, does this peace actually hold?
Well, the Second Boer War had a massive impact on South Africa. It reshaped the political and social landscape in ways that are still felt today.
Yeah, the sources I was looking at really emphasized the upheaval that followed the war. So what were some of the long-term consequences?
One of the biggest was how it deepened racial and ethnic divisions. The conflict was between the British and the Boers, but the indigenous African population, they were often caught in the crossfire.
They ended up marginalized, pushed off their land, and subjected to all sorts of discriminatory laws under British rule. It's a reminder that even though the main players were the Boers and the British, others paid a very heavy price.
Exactly. And then there's the economic impact. Remember the gold and diamonds that started all this? Well, those resources, they were firmly in British hands now. And that shaped South Africa's economic development for decades to come.
So the British basically leveraged their victory to solidify control over the region's most valuable assets.
That's one way to put it. They implemented policies that benefited them, often at the expense of the local population.
It sounds like the war ending didn't really solve the underlying problems, the things that led to the conflict in the first place.
You're absolutely right. It's more like those tensions were suppressed, buried under British control. But they didn't go away, and they would resurface later on, sometimes in even more complex ways.
It makes you think, even when a war is over, the effects can linger for generations. This war, its brutality, those unresolved issues, it casts a long shadow on South Africa's history.
And understanding this conflict is key to understanding the challenges South Africa faced later on. The struggle against apartheid, for instance, has roots in this period.
So even though the fighting stopped in 1902, the impact of the Second Boer War continued to reverberate through South African society for decades. This whole story, it's about courage, resilience, loss, and that constant struggle for freedom and self-determination.
It really makes you think about colonialism, the ethics of war, and the long-term consequences of decisions made in the heat of the moment.
It's amazing to think that this one war, the Second Boer War, really shaped so much of South Africa's future. The fight for resources, the tactics they used, the social and economic changes. It's just a really complex part of history.
And it's not even ancient history, right? The effects of this war, they're still felt today. The battles, the negotiations, the choices made back then, they're all woven into South Africa's politics, society, even their identity.
Yeah, it makes you think about how history, well, it's not just something in the past. It keeps influencing the present in all these unexpected ways.
Exactly. And for our listeners, it's not just about knowing facts and dates.
Yeah.
It's about understanding those forces that shaped the world we live in. The Second Boer War, I think it's a great example of how even when a conflict ends, the impact, the legacy, it takes generations to really sort out.
Makes you wonder, though, knowing what we know now, could things have been different? Was this clash, the British Empire versus the Boer Republics, was it inevitable?
Historians have debated that for years. Could the British have been, I don't know, more sensitive to the Boers' concerns, maybe handled the whole gold and diamond thing differently so it didn't lead to such a brutal conflict?
Yeah, and what about the Boers? Could they have seen just how powerful the British Empire really was and maybe negotiated something better, held on to some of their autonomy?
Hindsight is always 20/20, right? It's easy to look back and question the choices they made, but they were in a tough spot. Imperialism, nationalism, the desire for wealth, all these powerful forces at play. It's hard to say what could have really changed things.
But even if we can't rewrite history, I think there are still important lessons to learn here. So what stands out to you from everything we've discussed? What's the biggest takeaway from our deep dive into the Second Boer War?
For me, it's the strength of the human spirit. The Boers, they were outnumbered, outgunned, but they fought hard for what they believed in, their freedom, their way of life. They challenged a global empire, made them change their tactics, rethink their whole strategy.
Yeah, it really shows their courage, their resilience. They never gave up on what they were fighting for. And it reminds you that even when the odds are stacked against you, fighting for freedom, it can inspire amazing acts of bravery and sacrifice.
I'm thinking bigger picture. I think the Second Boer War forces us to confront some tough questions, right? About colonialism, the ethics of war, the lasting impact of decisions about power and resources.
It reminds us that history isn't just stories from the past. It shapes our world today in so many ways.
And that's why studying history matters. It's not just memorizing facts. It's about understanding the forces that got us here, the forces that'll shape our future.
So for you listening, why should this war fought over a century ago on another continent? Why should it matter today? Well, I hope this deep dive gave you a fresh perspective on this conflict, made you curious, maybe even left you with some questions of your own. What stood out to you? What surprised you? How do you think it connects to the world we live in? Keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep diving deep into history.